Okay, you see, hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Hello, welcome,
It's
Professor Jain.
audible.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Acha, shall I? You see, my topic is context COVID-19, migration, multiculturalism, and marginalization. You see, I am speaking from Toronto in Canada, and I cannot but tie up the local and the global, because that is also the framework for diaspora and transnationalism. My first point is about the methodological significance of the context. You see, critical happenings and imminent crisis have given rise to several kinds of creative and constructive. Hello, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, you are
Yes,
clear,
sir. Please
Professor Jain.
speak. No issue, sir.
Yes. Okay. Shall I continue?
Yes, sir. Please continue.
I see. So I mean, the COVID-19 context brings into focus the first thing is about migration and multiculturalism. Usually, migration is seen, especially overseas migration, along with culturalism in a very aseptic way, but the reality is much more complex. Diaspora and international migrations and settlements, you see, bring into focus the fact that from a policy perspective, as well as from many theories, the nation state is the container identity. It is the self-contained unit, but transnationalism and subnationalism challenge this idea of the nation state as the self-contained unit. There are departures and arrivals, and there are departures which are lapse of first, second, third migrations from one destination to the other. Therefore, questions when the migrants' identities are concerned are those of belonging and recognition, or in other terms, of identity and identification. And there are multiple dimensions of differentiation and intersectionality: region, language, gender, religion, race, ethnicity, caste, and so on. So that, in a sense, super diversity trumps over mere multiculturalism. There are many socials and socialities in which the migrants participate. So this is my first point, that the three M's that I speak of, migration, multiculturalism, and marginalization, of these, multiculturalism is already something which is superseded by the super diversity concept. Which brings me to the next topic, that of marginalization. And here we have to see the interplay of difference, diversity, and inequality. Thus, we have race in the US and globally also, caste in India, and the predicament of the Dalits, and capitalism, which is either in a minor form in the developing countries or in a full-blown sense in Europe and the US and North America, and also its impact in Latin America and Africa. So we have race, caste, and capitalism as burning examples. And for us, sociologists and anthropologists, the ethnographies of persecuted minorities the world over have to be encompassed within the framework of race, caste, and capitalism. Caste I am using in an expanded sense of hierarchical social stratification. In parenthesis, methodologically, beyond mere Cartesian positivism, we have to practice what Umberto Eco has called subversive etymologies. That is, we do not accept the official versions, but raise doubt to truth before speaking truth to power. Now, this is the context of marginalization, and I'll illustrate. For instance, there have been many studies, and as you know, the movement about Black Lives Matter has brought the situation of the black-white racial distinction into focus worldwide. And in the Indian context, the Dalits studies movement and the kind of works which Sarukai and Guru have produced, which Javre has produced, and so on, have given new insights into the marginalization of the Dalits. And for Latin America, I have been reading Michael Tosick, you see, for Colombia, and the way in which waves of paramilitary and forces patronized by global capitalism have affected the marginalization of the people. So marginalization is an issue which is very closely connected to diversity and super diversity. And then I come back to the Indian and global examples and back to the context of COVID-19. Muslims and the stereotypical behavior which we see in the Indian context, the victims being the minority Muslim community from a dogmatic point of view. So religion comes into play. Northeast and the stereotypical behavior, where race is another criterion which comes into play in the stereotypical behavior. Then economy, of course, is very important, and metropolises and the rural regional areas, the stereotypical behavior. For instance, there was an interpretation by certain journalists that why the people working in informal sectors in metropolitan areas go back to their regions in Bihar or Jharkhand or any other area is because of nostalgia, because of feeling for roots and so on. But they overlook the important thing that it is the question of survival. So we have a certain interpretation where nostalgia versus survival has to be taken into account. So again, this return to the haunting of culture, the single-stranded hollowness of multiculturalism as the explanation, because language and culture of the rural migrants to urban areas and in rural areas themselves is trumped by Bollywood, and social media. Now, in a very short summary that I am giving here, I have talked of migration, multiculturalism, and marginalization, and then come back to the Indian and global examples. But the conclusions would be that the three M's with which I started, multiculturalism, migration, and marginalization, multiculturalism is the villain of the piece. There are possibilities and limits of theory. For example, persecuted minorities and interpretive ethnography. For instance, I would give an example from my own work in Malaysia. I studied the plantation workers on Tamil plantation workers on Malaysian rubber estates. And subsequently, I went back thrice after a gap of decade, 2 decades, to study what has happened to the community now. And I find that there are certain choices which people have made in order to migrate out of the plantations and become rural or urban settlers and so on. But this is a kind of choice and risk taking which is calculated, whereas there is a study by Wilford on Tamils and the haunting of justice in Malaysia, where he uses Derrida's framework of deconstruction so heavily that the whole blame, so to say, it's the blame game which is highlighted. And the Tamilian people are shown as victims, you see, who are carrying the burden and resentment, etc., of Malay modernization, Islamic modernization, and so on and so forth. So I think what one has to look at are the possibilities and limits of theory, in the sense that on the one hand, we have ethnographies of persecuted minorities, which is in the framework of marginalization. But when it comes to interpretation, then there are interpretations which are either economic or Marxian in a broad sense, or there are theories which are highly philosophical and postmodernist. And I think in between is the state where most description and analysis has to rest. Now, finally, social movements and the new normal. Black Lives Matter movement in US and globally has worked apace with the pandemic towards a new normal. Now, I give the analogy of digital media versus reading of books and magazines. I mean, the two things are not canceling each other out. They proceed simultaneously. Similarly, there are other movements of social justice like CAA in India. COVID-19 gives a much needed pause to runaway globalization and thus catalyzing the search for a new normal. It has enabled us to look at what we had taken for granted as the normal and is now giving new ideas and technologies, at the same time telling what we should jettison in the old. I could go on to spell out, which Professor Kamla Ganesh has admirably done, as to what this new normal could be and would entail. But I'll stop here. Let me sum up by saying that I have talked of context COVID-19, but stuck to the theme of migration, multiculturalism, and marginalization in a local, that is the Indian and regional context on the one hand, and the global context on the other. but the context is that of COVID-19. So I think with these ideas, I think we should be able to project as students and researchers and scholars and intelligentsia who will continue to think of race, caste, class, and marginalization in the context of migration and multiculturalism in these kind of terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ravi. Thank you for the wonderful lecture.